Elon Musk fights off racists attacking Muslim man. What happened stuns all. The afternoon sun cast a golden hue over the crowded plaza. The sound of bustling conversations and footsteps mixing with the distant hum of traffic. People were going about their business, some pausing to admire street art, others rushing to meetings, and a few sitting at nearby benches, enjoying the warmth of the day. In the heart of the crowd, a scene was unfolding that would soon capture the attention of everyone in the vicinity. A man, wearing a traditional Muslim headdress, stood near a cafe, adjusting his bag as he prepared to make his way through the crowd. He was tall and unassuming, his face calm as he scanned the surroundings, unaware of the trouble that was about to find him. Across the street, a group of 3 men had just stepped out of a pub, laughing loudly among themselves, their voices cutting through the hum of the city. But their laughter wasn't born from joy, it was taunting, mocking. One of the men, tall with a scruffy beard and a heavy build, locked eyes with the Muslim man, his gaze sharp and full of contempt. He nudged his friends, and they followed his line of sight. It didn't take long before the trio began to approach the unsuspecting man, their steps deliberate, as if they were drawn to something they intended to destroy. The crowd seemed to shrink away, as though they could feel the shift in energy, the tension growing in the air. "You lost, pal?" The voice came from the man in the front of the group, his words dripping with mockery. "You need help finding your way? Or are you just here to spread your nonsense?" The Muslim man's face tightened slightly, but he didn't respond immediately. His eyes flickered toward the group, measuring them, before turning back to face forward, hoping to ignore them. But the insults didn't stop. The group of men circled around him, their laughter growing louder. "You think you can walk around here like that?" Another man shouted, his voice full of derision. "Go back to where you came from. We don't want you here." The Muslim man's pace quickened, his instinct to avoid conflict taking over. But it wasn't enough. The man in front of him reached out and shoved him roughly, causing him to stumble backward. The crowd, unsure of how to react, paused. Some standing still, others looking nervously at their phones, but no one stepped in to help. The situation was quickly escalating, and it was clear that the trio wasn't going to let the man walk away without humiliating him. The Muslim man regained his balance, his heart pounding in his chest. He stood tall, but the fear in his eyes betrayed him. He tried to step back, but the man who had shoved him blocked his way, leering at him. "What's wrong? You can't take a joke? Maybe we should teach you a lesson in respect." Just as the situation seemed poised to turn violent, the sound of footsteps broke through the tension. A figure appeared from the edge of the crowd, his expression unreadable but his presence undeniable. It was Elon Musk, a figure known around the world for his innovation, his ambition, and his status. But in this moment, he wasn't the tech mogul or the billionaire entrepreneur. He was simply a man, standing up against injustice. Elon had been walking through the plaza, his mind occupied with business matters when the disturbance had caught his attention. He had paused, his eyes scanning the scene, quickly piecing together what was happening. The group of men, the taunts, the aggression directed at the Muslim man, it was all too familiar. It was something he couldn't ignore. He moved toward the confrontation, his steps measured and purposeful, as the crowd seemed to part just enough to allow him through. As he neared the scene, Elon could hear the words being shouted, the hateful slurs that were being thrown without restraint. He didn't hesitate. He stepped forward, his voice firm, cutting through the chaos. "That's enough," Elon said, his voice loud enough to stop the men in their tracks. The trio turned to face him, confusion flickering in their eyes as they tried to make sense of the interruption. The man who had been doing most of the shouting sneered. "What's this? Another rich guy trying to save the world?" He looked Elon up and down, sizing him up with a smirk. "You gonna make us stop? Or are you just gonna talk?" Elon didn't respond with more words. He didn't need to. Instead, he moved quickly, grabbing the man by the arm with surprising force, his grip locking onto the aggressor's wrist. The man tried to pull away, but Elon's strength was unyielding. "I'm not asking you again," Elon said, his tone cold. There was no hesitation in his voice. He wasn't here to debate or argue. He was here to stop this. The other two men looked uncertain now, glancing at each other, unsure whether to escalate the situation further. But Elon's presence had shifted the dynamic. You can either walk away now, or you can make this worse for yourself. Elon continued, his voice steady. His grip tightened slightly, not in anger but in resolve. The man who had been taunting the Muslim man seemed to realize, with growing dread, that this wasn't a situation he could control anymore. He tried to jerk his arm away again, but Elon didn't budge. The crowd around them had gone silent, the earlier murmurs now replaced by the weight of what was happening. The Muslim man, who had been on the verge of retreating into himself, now stood motionless behind Elon, his wide eyes reflecting the sudden turn of events. Elon stood firm, his back straight, his jaw set in quiet determination. He wasn't going to back down from this. This was a moment that needed to be addressed, not with violence, but with strength, with action. The man's eyes narrowed, his confusion giving way to irritation. He hadn't expected to be confronted by someone like Elon Musk, the kind of figure who commanded attention not just for his wealth, but for his presence. He sized Elon up, taking in the tailored suit, the sharp features, the almost cold intensity in his eyes. For a moment, the man hesitated, as if unsure of how to proceed. This wasn't just some random passerby. This was someone who could make a scene, who had the kind of power that could change the course of this entire situation. But the hesitation lasted only a moment. "Is this guy for real?" the man muttered to his friends, his voice dripping with contempt. His friends, standing just behind him, looked uneasily between each other, as if unsure whether to get involved or back off. The third man, who had been mostly silent, shifted nervously from one foot to the other. His earlier bravado seemed to have evaporated as the confrontation grew more intense. Elon didn't flinch. He kept his grip steady on the man's wrist, his expression unwavering. "It's not too late to walk away," he said quietly, but with a tone that carried authority. He wasn't shouting, he wasn't escalating, but the power behind his words was undeniable. The man sneered, trying once more to pull his arm away, but Elon's grip was firm. The crowd around them had started to gather more closely, whispers rippling through the onlookers. Phones were coming out, recording the scene. Everyone wanted to see what would happen next. The tension was palpable, thick in the air. "You think you can just step in and stop this?" the man asked, his voice growing louder now, filled with indignation. "You think just because you're some billionaire you can tell me what to do?" His words were laced with frustration, but there was something else there now, a flicker of doubt. Elon wasn't backing down, and the man could feel that in the air. "I'm not telling you what to do," Elon replied, his voice calm. "I'm telling you that this isn't the way to act. You can choose to walk away now. I'm giving you that chance." The other two men were now shifting uneasily, the situation clearly taking a turn they hadn't expected. The confident bravado that had marked their approach was now beginning to crumble under the weight of Elon's calm and unwavering demeanor. They weren't sure how to handle this, unsure whether to escalate or to retreat. For a moment, everything seemed frozen, as if the world around them had paused. The only movement was the slow rise and fall of Elon's chest as he stood there, still holding the man's wrist, his eyes never leaving the man's face. "Are you really going to let this guy talk to you like that?" one of the man's friends asked, his voice high-pitched with nervousness. It was clear that the group was starting to feel the weight of the situation. They hadn't anticipated this kind of response, and they weren't sure how to handle it. The man, still struggling against Elon's grip, shot a glance at his friends. They weren't going to step in. It was just him, and for the first time he could feel his resolve cracking. His mouth opened, but the words that came out were not the aggressive insults he had been throwing earlier. They were hesitant, uncertain. "What's your problem? Huh?" he spat, his tone faltering. "Why are you getting involved in this? Just mind your own business." Elon's response was immediate, his grip tightening just enough to emphasize his point. "You've already made it my business," he said. There was no anger in his voice, but there was an undeniable edge to it. "And now it's time for you to leave." For a moment, The man seemed to struggle with the words, his anger fading into something more complex. Fear, perhaps, or confusion. The grip on his wrist didn't waver. The feeling of power that had initially surged through him was quickly draining away, replaced by a slow realization that he wasn't the one in control anymore. The third man, who had been quiet up until this point, looked nervously at his friends, clearly unsure of how to proceed. He stepped back, almost involuntarily, as if sensing that the situation was getting out of hand. The man who had been the most vocal, however, continued to resist, trying to pull away with a fierce, if futile, determination. "You really think you're going to make me leave?" he challenged, his voice now laced with desperation. "You think you're the only one who's had a hard time in this world? You don't know anything about me. You don't know anything about what I've been through." Elon's expression softened just slightly, but there was still no sympathy in his eyes. "This isn't about you," he said quietly. "This is about right and wrong. And right now, what you're doing is wrong." The man's eyes flicked to the boy, who had been standing silently behind Elon this whole time. His body still stiff with fear. The boy's eyes were wide, his face streaked with tears, his hands clasped tightly together as he stood there, barely daring to move. The man hesitated again, and this time, for a brief moment, something changed in his face. It wasn't regret, not yet, but it was recognition that he had gone too far. But before the man could speak again, a low, rumbling voice from the back of the crowd cut through the air. "Maybe it's time for you to go," the voice said, loud enough to reach the trio. Elon didn't turn around. He could feel the change in the crowd, the shift in energy. People were watching now, not just as passive bystanders, but as active witnesses. The man who had been resisting finally stopped struggling. His eyes flickered from the boy to Elon, and then to the group around them. Slowly, as if weighing the situation, he took a step back, his anger still simmering, but now giving way to uncertainty. "Get out of here," one of the onlookers muttered, just loud enough for the man to hear. The man glanced over, but he didn't speak again. The shift in the air had become undeniable. The confrontation was losing its edge. Elon remained where he stood, his grip still firm but not forceful, allowing the man to make his choice. The crowd had shifted. The threat was no longer just Elon or the man. It was the weight of all the eyes on them. And the man knew in that moment he had lost. The man stood frozen, his feet rooted to the ground, his mind racing. The moment of confrontation had lasted far longer than he anticipated. His bravado had cracked under Elon's calm, unwavering presence. And now, it was as if the world had shifted, and he found himself surrounded by invisible forces stronger than anything he could muster. The crowd, once murmuring with nervous curiosity, had become a unified presence, their collective gaze focused squarely on him. It wasn't just Elon Musk standing there now. It was the weight of every pair of eyes watching his every move. He glanced over his shoulder at his two friends, who had been standing by as silent spectators, but now they, too, seemed uncertain, hesitant even. They exchanged brief glances, their faces etched with unease. Neither of them had expected the situation to escalate like this. None of them had. The man's gaze shifted back to Elon, whose expression remained unchanging, resolute. There was no sign of fear or hesitation in the billionaire's eyes. There was only quiet authority. Elon's grip remained steady on his wrist, unyielding. It wasn't just about the physical strength he exerted, but the unwavering conviction that this man's actions had consequences, and they would not be allowed to go unchallenged. "You don't know what it's like to be in my shoes," the man spat, his voice shaky, the anger now mixing with something else. Fear, guilt, maybe even the beginnings of regret. But it wasn't enough to break him completely. The resentment still lingered in his voice, a last-ditch attempt to maintain some control over the situation. "You don't know the things I've had to do, the people I've had to deal with." Elon didn't answer immediately. Instead, he waited, allowing the man to finish his sentence, his voice calm, but his gaze unwavering. He didn't need to engage in the man's excuses. This wasn't about justifying or understanding the man's actions. It was about the reality of what was happening in this moment. "What I do know," Elon finally said, his voice low and steady, "is that what you're doing right now is wrong. It's unjust. And you don't get to hide behind your excuses anymore." The man's jaw clenched. He opened his mouth to say something more, but the words didn't come. The anger that had once been so loud and dominating seemed to drain from him, leaving only confusion and frustration behind. He tugged once more out of instinct than actual intention, but the grip didn't loosen. He glanced around again at the growing crowd, the murmurs growing louder, more disapproving. His pride was being chipped away piece by piece. "You can't just walk up to people and think you can do whatever you want," Elon continued, his words cutting through the man's resistance. "Not anymore. Not here. Not in front of these people." The man's eyes shifted briefly to the bystanders. They weren't just watching anymore. They were beginning to take sides, silently but decisively. One person had muttered something earlier, a quiet encouragement to Elon's intervention. But now, the crowd seemed to grow braver, more vocal. The balance of power had shifted, and the man was realizing too late that the moment he had started was slipping from his grasp. He wasn't in control anymore. The crowd had grown quiet but resolute, their attention completely focused on him. As Elon held the man in place, the crowd began to murmur again, but this time it was different. It wasn't the nervous, unsure whispers from before. It was something more deliberate, more direct. People were starting to move closer, a sense of collective resolve forming between them. They weren't just witnesses now, they were part of this confrontation. Their presence alone was a form of judgment, one that made it impossible for the man to continue his harassment without facing the consequences. It was becoming clear to him. If he didn't back down, this wasn't going to end well for him. But his pride, the last thing he had left, wouldn't let him admit it. His mouth twisted into a sneer, a final attempt to salvage his dignity. "You think you're a hero, huh?" he said, trying to sound tough. "Some big shot who's going to save the day? You don't know anything about me. I've been through worse than you can even imagine." Elon didn't flinch. He didn't raise his voice. His presence alone was enough to silence the man's bluster. "It doesn't matter what you've been through," he said softly. "What matters is what you do right now." The man, looking more lost with every passing second, finally let out a frustrated sigh, realizing that his words held no weight anymore. He glanced down at the ground, unsure of what to do. His fight had drained away, replaced by a quiet desperation. He had crossed a line, and there was no way to erase it. Elon didn't release his grip on the man's wrist, but his tone softened. "Walk away," he said. His voice still firm but with the kind of resolve that left no room for argument. "You don't need to do this. Just walk away." For a moment, it seemed like the man might refuse, like he might keep fighting, even if just for the sake of pride. But the reality of the situation was sinking in. He had no escape, not unless he backed down. The weight of his actions was bearing down on him, and there was no one left to blame but himself. Elon, without needing to say another word, stepped aside slightly, allowing the man a clear path. The message was simple: he had been given a choice. The man stood there for a few moments longer, his fists clenched at his sides, his chest rising and falling with quick, shallow breaths. The anger that had once burned so brightly had begun to smolder, slowly dying out under the intensity of the moment. The crowd was waiting. The onlookers, the people who had witnessed his cruelty and aggression, were waiting for him to make his move. And in that silence, the man realized that there was no victory to be found here. No amount of defiance would erase what he had done. He hesitated, looking around one final time, before slowly, almost reluctantly, backing away. His gaze flicked once more to the Muslim man who had been the target of his cruelty, but there was no more hatred in his eyes, just resignation. He didn't speak another word, and without a word, the man turned and walked away, the sound of his footsteps echoing in the tense silence. As the man slowly retreated, his back turned to Elon, the crowd remained eerily still, watching his every step as if waiting for him to falter, to turn around and resume his hostility. But he didn't. The distance between him and the Muslim man who had been the target of his rage continued to grow, the crowd slowly parting to allow him to leave without further incident. Elon stood there, his eyes locked on the retreating figure, but his body remained loose and composed. He hadn't won a battle today. There had been no physical altercation, no violent escalation. Yet, there was something powerful about this moment, something that lingered in the air, a sense of justice not achieved through force but through quiet intervention. The silence stretched between the figures on the street. It wasn't just the man walking away. It was the collective sigh of relief from the crowd, as if they, too, had been holding their breath, unsure whether this confrontation would spiral into something worse. But it didn't. Instead, the oppressive weight of fear and violence lifted, and the moment of reckoning seemed to have passed, leaving behind only a lingering tension. Elon turned toward the Muslim man, still standing behind him. His hands were now free from the grip that had once shielded him, but the fear in his eyes hadn't completely subsided. He wasn't trembling anymore, but his posture remained rigid, as if the events were still replaying in his mind, just waiting for something else to happen. Elon took a step closer, his voice gentle but firm. "Are you okay?" The man didn't respond immediately, his eyes scanning the crowd, looking for anyone who might show more signs of aggression. He was processing the fact that he had made it through the encounter, but the aftermath had left him disoriented. It wasn't just about the fear of being attacked. It was the terror that people might see him as a target, that every moment of peace was just a brief interlude before the next danger. The crowd, which had once seemed so passive and unsure, was beginning to dissipate now, their gazes shifting away from the scene. Some people returned to their business, while others lingered for a few more seconds, still processing what had unfolded. There was no applause, no outpouring of praise for the intervention. It was just a quiet acknowledgement, shared by all who had been present, of something significant that had just happened. The Muslim man's gaze slowly shifted to Elon. He blinked a few times, as if unsure of what to say, before he finally spoke, his voice quiet but steady. I don't know how to thank you." Elon shook his head slightly, his expression softening. "You don't have to. No one should have to deal with that." For a moment, the two stood there, the weight of the situation beginning to settle between them. Elon could feel the lingering tension in the man's shoulders, the unease that hadn't fully dissipated. But he also felt something else, a sense of solidarity, a sense of shared humanity in the face of cruelty. "Are you sure you're all right?" Elon asked again, his voice more insistent this time. The man nodded slowly, though his eyes still darted around, looking over his shoulder to make sure the confrontation was really over. The fear hadn't left him, but it had been replaced with something else. A quiet gratitude, a recognition that he wasn't alone in this fight. "I'll be fine," the man said finally, his voice tinged with exhaustion. It's hard, you know? Every day, there's a part of you that wonders if it's going to happen again." Elon could understand that. It wasn't just about the physical threat, the potential violence. It was about the emotional toll, the constant state of alertness that came with knowing you were at risk of being targeted for something you couldn't control. That kind of fear was insidious, wearing you down long after the immediate danger had passed. The man exhaled slowly, his eyes meeting Elon's for the first time since the confrontation. There was no longer any anger in his expression, only the quiet understanding that he had been protected, that someone had stood with him when it mattered. "I don't know what you saw, but it wasn't me," the man said, his voice shaking slightly. "I didn't ask for this. I don't want to be part of this. But every day it's the same thing. The hate, the violence. It's like people forget who we are. Who we all are." Elon nodded, his eyes narrowing as he processed the words. It wasn't just a one-time thing. This wasn't just some random incident. This was part of something bigger. Something that had been brewing for far too long, feeding on division, fear, and hatred. And it wasn't just about standing up to one person. It was about standing up to an entire system of hatred, one that sought to divide people on the basis of their identities, their cultures, their beliefs. "We all deserve better than this," Elon said, his voice firm, his words carrying a weight that seemed to echo in the stillness around them. He wasn't talking just to the man in front of him. He was speaking to the crowd, to the world at large, to anyone who was willing to listen. And we're not going to get there if we stay silent. The man's eyes widened slightly, as if Elon's words had struck a chord deep inside him. He blinked a few times, taking in the magnitude of the statement, the weight of what Elon was trying to say. For the first time since the incident began, he seemed to stand taller, the last remnants of fear retreating under the quiet strength of the words. It wasn't just a gesture of physical protection. It was a message, a call to stand against the hate, to refuse to let fear rule the world any longer. As the man absorbed Elon's words, the sound of distant sirens filled the air. The moment that had felt suspended in time, the moment when tension had reached its peak, was slowly beginning to fade. The police were coming to secure the area, but the truth of what had happened wasn't something that could be easily undone. It wasn't just about making sure the man who had started the confrontation was dealt with. It was about something deeper, something that reached into the hearts of everyone who had witnessed it. It was a reminder that there was power in standing together, that we didn't have to face the world alone. The sirens grew louder, cutting through the quiet like an ominous warning. The police cars were now visible, their flashing lights painting the street in a surreal mix of red and blue, as if a scene from a movie had suddenly come to life. But in reality, the tension in the air was palpable, thick with uncertainty. The crowd, which had been frozen in place just moments before, began to stir as the reality of the situation set in. People were pulling away, some returning to their daily lives, others staying behind to exchange whispered words about what they had just witnessed. Elon stood still, his gaze fixed on the man in front of him. He didn't move, didn't flinch as the officers approached, as the tension in the air grew tighter. The police weren't rushing, though they didn't need to. The situation had already been handled, not through force but through intervention, through the kind of quiet authority that Elon had brought to the moment. And yet, as the sirens continued to wail in the distance, there was something more at play here. A realization that something much larger was being confronted. The man, still standing just a few feet away, seemed to sense the shift. The anger and bravado that had driven him to attack the Muslim man earlier had disappeared, replaced by a growing sense of confusion. He didn't know what had just happened. His body was tense, his movements uncertain as he glanced from Elon to the approaching officers. The weight of the situation had finally sunk in, and there was no more escape. The truth was too stark to deny now. But the man didn't speak. He didn't try to argue or resist, not anymore. He was still processing, still unsure of how he had ended up in this position, still trying to reconcile the aggression he had unleashed with the realization that his actions had consequences. Elon, on the other hand, stood firm, his hands now relaxed at his sides, his focus on the man. He wasn't going to make a spectacle of this. He wasn't here for some grand confrontation. He was here because something had to be done. The words he had spoken to the man weren't just an invitation to retreat. They were a challenge to rethink what was happening, to reconsider the course of action that had brought them here. The officers, now close enough to intervene, stopped a few paces away, their eyes scanning the situation. They hadn't been here long enough to see the escalation that had led to this moment, but they could sense the shift in the atmosphere. The crowd was no longer tense, no longer worried about an immediate threat. The situation was under control, but it was still delicate. One of the officers, a tall man with a stern expression, stepped forward. His eyes flicked from Elon to the man, and then to the crowd that had started to disperse, their curiosity satisfied for the moment. The officer didn't ask what had happened. He didn't need to. The body language of everyone involved told the story. "You all right?" the officer asked, his eyes locking onto the Muslim man, who was still standing behind Elon, his gaze uncertain but grateful. The Muslim man nodded, though his voice trembled slightly. "I'm fine," he said, his eyes scanning the crowd that had gathered, the realization dawning on him that he had survived this confrontation. He had made it through. The officer nodded slowly, his face softening just a little. "Good. We'll take care of the rest." He motioned to his partners, who were beginning to move forward to deal with the man who had started the altercation. The officer didn't speak to him yet. He didn't need to. The man was clearly not in a position to argue anymore. He had already lost whatever strength his insults had once given him. Elon didn't step back, didn't move to leave. His eyes followed the officers as they carefully moved in to restrain the man who had been causing the trouble. But Elon didn't need to see the situation wrapped up neatly. He had already done what he came to do. He had made it clear that hate, that cruelty wasn't going to be tolerated. And now, the rest of it would be handled by the authorities. The crowd had all but dissipated, the buzz of curiosity now replaced by a lingering sense of relief. It was over, at least for now. But for the Muslim man, this moment wasn't just over. It was something that would stay with him for a long time. He wasn't just relieved to have survived the attack. He was changed, in some way, by the simple act of intervention, by the quiet but unshakable presence of a man who refused to let hate thrive. I don't know what to say," the Muslim man said, turning to Elon, his voice still thick with emotion. His words were hesitant, as if unsure how to express his gratitude. "I didn't think anyone would stop it. I didn't think anyone cared." Elon gave him a small, understanding smile. "That's the problem," he said simply. "Most people don't realize how important it is to speak up, to do something. It's not enough to just watch." The man nodded, his eyes beginning to well up with tears. It wasn't just the weight of what had happened. It was the realization that anyone had stepped in when it mattered most. That someone had shown him, without words, that he wasn't alone in this world, that there were people who cared. "I'll never forget this," the man said quietly. "Thank you." Elon gave him a slight nod. "You don't have to. Just promise me you'll never let anyone tell you that you don't belong." The words lingered in the air, and for a moment, it felt as if the world had shifted just slightly, the smallest bit of change spreading like a ripple through the crowd. As the police officers began to escort the man who had caused the altercation away, Elon turned to leave, his steps steady. The moment was still fresh, still sharp in everyone's minds. But the truth of it, the weight of it, would follow each person who had witnessed it, even as they went back to their daily lives. There was power in standing up for what was right. There was power in not letting hate win. And though the scene was fading behind him, Elon knew that something had changed in that brief, intense moment. Something that could ripple outward. The air felt different now, charged in a way that hadn't been present just minutes before. The officers were handling the man who had caused the disturbance, leading him away toward their cars as the crowd began to disperse, returning to their daily lives, but with something intangible lingering in the background. The street was returning to normal, but something about this moment seemed to have altered its course. There was an awareness, a recognition, that some invisible line had been drawn, one that no longer allowed such cruelty to fester unnoticed. Elon had been standing off to the side, quietly observing as the situation continued to unfold, his mind not on the fleeting interaction he had just had, but on the larger message that had been conveyed. His actions, calm and resolute, had been the catalyst that had shifted the balance of power, but they had been far more than just a response to aggression. They were a statement. Cruelty would not go unanswered. Hate would not be allowed to thrive unchecked. As the officers began to move the man further down the street, Elon turned back to the Muslim man, still standing in the same spot where the confrontation had taken place. The man's posture was no longer as rigid as before, his shoulders slightly relaxed, but there was still a flicker of hesitation in his movements. His eyes, though, were different, no longer filled with fear, but with something more guarded, something more aware of the world around him. "You all right?" Elon asked again, his voice quiet, as he stepped closer. The man nodded, but it was a slow, deliberate motion. His gaze flicked over the now empty space where the scene had unfolded. I'm okay. Just a lot to process, you know." He looked at Elon for a moment, his expression softening. "I don't even know your name. You just stepped in. Like you knew exactly what to do." Elon glanced down for a moment, almost as though reflecting on the question. His eyes met the man's again, and he gave a small, purposeful nod. "Sometimes you don't need to know what to do. You just need to know when to act." The words hung in the air for a moment, and the Muslim man looked at him thoughtfully, as though trying to understand the deeper meaning behind them. He exhaled slowly, his hand rubbing the back of his neck as the weight of the entire experience seemed to hit him all at once. The adrenaline had begun to ebb away, leaving him with a sense of clarity, but also exhaustion. "I didn't think anyone would care," the man said softly, his voice carrying a layer of vulnerability that hadn't been there before. His eyes searched Elon's, trying to read him, as though there was something he still didn't fully understand about this encounter. Elon tilted his head slightly, his gaze unflinching. "Everyone deserves someone to stand with them when they're being wronged. If we don't do it, who will?" The man absorbed the words, his expression becoming thoughtful, as though his view of the world had shifted in the course of a few minutes. He had lived with the quiet weight of prejudice for so long, never expecting anything to change, never expecting anyone to actually intervene. The encounter had made him see something different, maybe not a solution, but the possibility of change, a flicker of hope. And that hope hadn't come from a distant political leader or some public figure, but from a person standing in front of him, acting with no fanfare, no announcement, just stepping forward when it counted most. "You know," the man said after a beat, his voice still quieter but filled with the weight of realization, "I don't think I've ever felt this protected before. Not in a long time. Not like this." Elon took a moment to process the words, his gaze shifting toward the scene that had now fallen silent. "Protection doesn't always come with a badge or a uniform," he said quietly. "Sometimes it just comes from people who choose not to stand by." The Muslim man looked at him for a long time, something unspoken passing between them. There was no grand gesture, no grand speech, just two individuals understanding the value of standing up for what's right. The realization seemed to settle in the man's chest, spreading like a warmth that he hadn't known was there before. He nodded slowly, his posture less tense than before. "You're right," he murmured. "I've spent so much time trying to avoid confrontation, but maybe this is how things change. Maybe it's just about standing up and saying, 'No more.'" Elon didn't respond right away. His eyes flicked over to the officers who were now walking the man away, their actions efficient, but there was no rush. The outcome was inevitable, but in that moment it seemed almost irrelevant. What mattered was what had been set in motion, the ripple effect of standing up against hate, the subtle shift that began the moment Elon chose to intervene. This moment wasn't over, not yet. It would continue to ripple outward, felt in ways no one could predict. "What happens next?" the man asked, breaking Elon's train of thought. Elon paused, his gaze fixed on the officers and the fading figure of the man who had tried to start the altercation. He thought for a moment before answering, his words simple yet profound. "What happens next," Elon said, turning back to the man with a quiet smile, "is up to you. What you choose to do with this moment is yours." The man's expression softened, and for the first time since the confrontation had started, he allowed himself a small, genuine smile. It was a smile of understanding, of appreciation, and maybe even a little relief. "I'll remember this," he said softly. "I'll remember that someone cared enough to act." And with that, the street seemed to quiet once more, the lingering tension dissipating into the stillness. The police officers had moved on, and the crowd had all but melted away, their curiosity satisfied. But the man and Elon remained there for a moment longer, the weight of what had transpired still lingering between them, neither of them quite ready to let go of the shift that had occurred. This moment, small in its detail but monumental in its impact, had already set something into motion, something that couldn't be undone. The crowd had dispersed, and the scene on the street seemed to return to some semblance of normalcy. But the lingering tension in the air remained palpable. People resumed walking, some still casting quick glances toward Elon and the man who had been caught in the aftermath of the confrontation. The hum of the city filled the gaps left by the silence, but underneath it all was something more. A recognition that something significant had just happened, even if most couldn't fully articulate what it was. Elon remained standing in the same spot for a few moments longer, his eyes sweeping over the space. The police had taken the man away, and the street was slowly returning to its usual rhythm. But the words, the exchange, the quiet yet powerful message of intervention, it wasn't something easily forgotten. The moment had rippled through the crowd, leaving a trail that would undoubtedly be felt long after the event had passed. The Muslim man, who had been standing nearby, still seemed to be processing the encounter. He hadn't moved from the spot where he had stood for most of the confrontation, his eyes now gazing at the ground, the weight of the moment still sitting heavily on his shoulders. Elon watched him for a moment, then slowly walked toward him, his steps deliberate, but not rushed. He wasn't looking for recognition or thanks. This wasn't about some heroic gesture. It was about something much more fundamental. The moment had been a reminder of what it meant to stand up for what was right, even when it wasn't easy, even when the consequences were uncertain. "You should get going," Elon said softly, his voice carrying across the space between them. The man looked up, and for a moment, their gazes locked. There was something unspoken between them, a mutual understanding, a shared acknowledgement that this moment had changed them both. The Muslim man didn't immediately answer, but his lips pressed into a thin line as he seemed to gather his thoughts. "I didn't expect this," he said finally, his voice quiet but firm. "I didn't expect anyone to step in. I didn't expect anyone to care." Elon nodded, his expression softening slightly. He wasn't one to speak often about the deeper truths of his actions. In moments like these, words seemed too small, too inadequate for what was truly happening beneath the surface. But he understood what the man was saying. It wasn't just about the physical intervention. It was about the larger, more profound impact of standing up in the face of hate, of letting someone know that they weren't alone. That, in itself, could change everything. "You'd be surprised," Elon said after a beat, his voice steady. "Most people do care. They just don't always know how to act." The man shifted his weight slightly, his eyes flicking toward the direction where the police had taken the man away. His jaw clenched, and for a moment, it seemed like he was still processing the ugliness of what had just happened. But as he turned back to Elon, something in his expression had shifted. The fear and doubt that had marked his demeanor earlier were now gone. There was a quiet determination in his eyes, a realization that this experience had changed him in ways he might not fully understand yet. "I thought I was just some guy walking through the street," he said, his voice tinged with disbelief. "Just some guy who didn't matter. But I'm not. None of us are invisible." Elon gave him a small, encouraging smile, the kind that suggested he understood what the man was beginning to grasp. "Exactly. That's the point. We're all visible, and we all have a part to play." The man took a deep breath, looking around him as if seeing the world through a different lens. He wasn't just a victim anymore. He was part of a larger story, one that could be shaped by the choices people made in moments like these. He wasn't alone, and that realization, as simple as it seemed, was one of the most powerful things a person could experience. "I don't know what's next," the man admitted, his voice still quiet but filled with a newfound strength. "But I'm not going to forget this. I'm not going to forget what you did, what we all saw today." Elon's expression softened, his gaze steady. "You don't have to," he said. "But remember this. The real work starts after moments like this. It's about what you do next, how you choose to stand up, how you choose to make sure this never happens again." The words hung between them, heavy but hopeful. For the first time since the incident had started, the Muslim man felt something shift inside him. It wasn't a magical solution, and it wasn't a grand revelation. It was just a quiet acknowledgement that something had been set into motion, that standing up for what's right wasn't a one-time thing. It was a choice that had to be made over and over by everyone, and that, in itself, was powerful. The sound of distant voices reached them, a reminder that the world around them was moving forward, unaffected by what had transpired here. But for the Muslim man, this moment would remain a turning point. It wasn't just about surviving the confrontation. It was about owning his story, about finding his voice in the midst of hate. As the officers finished their work and the last of the crowd began to fade, Elon took a final look at the man. There was no need for more words. The message had been made clear. The battle against hate and cruelty wasn't over, but it had taken a small, significant step forward. one action at a time, one person at a time. And with that, Elon turned and walked away, his steps steady, his presence lingering in the air like an invisible thread tying the threads of change together. The Muslim man stood for a moment longer, taking in the quiet of the street, his breath steady now, his body no longer tense. He had witnessed something that had changed him, and now it was up to him to decide how that change would shape the world around him. The crowd had finally dispersed, the sound of their footsteps fading into the background as the tension of the moment began to lift. The sun was beginning to set, casting a soft golden light over the scene, now eerily calm compared to the chaos that had erupted just moments ago. The street, once filled with the hum of discontent and fear, now seemed like any other part of the city. Busy, vibrant, full of life, but it would never quite feel the same to the Muslim man who had stood there in the face of hate. He took a long breath, his body still tingling with the residual tension of the encounter, but something was different now. He wasn't the same man who had walked into the plaza moments before, caught in the crosshairs of aggression and prejudice. No, he was someone who had witnessed what true courage looked like, not in grandiose gestures or loud speeches, but in the quiet strength of someone who saw injustice and chose to act. Elon Musk had not just stepped in physically, but symbolically, shifting the tide and offering a lesson that would echo long after the confrontation had ended. And it wasn't just about what Elon did for him in that moment. It was about the ripple effect that would spread beyond this scene, beyond these people. What would the onlookers take away from this? What would the man himself take with him as he walked away from this place? It wasn't just about surviving an attack. It was about realizing that standing up, intervening, and refusing to stay silent when faced with cruelty was something all of us could do. We all have a choice in moments like these. A choice to stand with someone, to say no to hate, and to refuse to let the dark forces of intolerance define our world. For those of you watching this, think about the moments in your life. Have you ever witnessed something that made you uncomfortable, made you question what was happening around you? It's easy to feel like we're powerless in the face of hate or violence. It's easy to think that if we don't speak up, nothing will change. But the truth is, change happens in small moments, in the quiet decision to step forward, even when it's not easy. What do you think? How do you think this situation would have unfolded if no one had intervened? How do we, as a society, handle moments like this? Can we take the lessons learned here and apply them in our own lives? I want to hear from you. What would you have done in Elon's place? Or in the place of the Muslim man who had been the target of this hateful act? How do you think we can all work together to create a world where standing up for what's right is the norm, not the exception? Thank you for being part of this, for watching, and for thinking about how you can make a difference. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Your voice matters.